So we're here at PAX East 2018, and I'm about to interview one of the lead developers of Pantheon. And I've been really looking forward to this because we're about to take a closer look at all of the classes in the game. So let's go ahead and see what he has to say. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bazgrim, and we've kind of stepped away from the chaos of the convention for a little bit to just sit down and talk about Pantheon with none other than Chris Perkins of Visionary Realms. So Chris, thank you so much for sitting down with me for a little bit.
That's my pleasure. Yeah, it's exciting.
So how's the convention going for you so far?
It's going really well. We've seen a lot of traffic. There's been a lot of really good interest in the game, both from fans that we expected, and then lots of new people that just are walking by, seeing visuals, seeing the game on the monitors, and really drawn in. It's been really great.
Awesome. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So most people probably know you as Joppa in the community. So if you could, though, just give us a brief overview of what your role actually is at Visionary Realms.
Okay. So I started as the music composer and kind of slowly worked into the position that I'm in now, which is creative director, lead game designer, and audio director.
Awesome.
So my primary roles are as creative director to oversee the gameplay, the art, the writing, the audio, all of the creative side of things that go into the game. But unlike traditional creative directors, I'm also very hands-on. So there's a lot of world building that I do. Like the Amber Fate Zone is one of the ones that I built. There's a lot of actual data input that I do with itemization for the different zones. And class design is one of my big kind of primary focuses. So both the conceptualization of the classes and then creating the abilities and data and things like that.
And that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about today.
Yeah.
So you're a man of many hats, but today I wanted to kind of start peeling back the layers a little bit on some of the classes, especially the ones that we don't really know anything about, just to kind of get a brief overview of why they're in the game, you know? So I guess that would start with, we know that the quaternity is in effect in Pantheon rather than the Trinity. So if you could just tell us which classes typically fit in each one of those roles.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the tank archetype, which would include the warrior, the paladin, and the dire lord. We have the healers, which would be the cleric, the druid, and the shaman. We have the DPS, which would be the caster DPS would be the wizard and the summoner, and then melee DPS would be the rogue, the monk, and the ranger. And then we have the crowd control archetype, which would be filled by the enchanter, and
Okay. So that's interesting, though, that the enchanter is the only crowd control class in the game, right? Because every other role, there's 3 or 4 classes in each, but the enchanter is, if somebody needs crowd control, they need to go to an enchanter.
Yeah, well, and so I'll go ahead and say that there is another class that would fill that role, and that would be the bard. And just to kind of make the soft announcement, it is something that I feel confident, from my perspective, that we will be able to have the bard in by launch. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm sure there's lots of people that are excited to hear that.
I hope so. I think I heard a faint shout of joy somewhere.
So on the class descriptions on the website, I see this term used in each one of them called an iconic ability. So what is an iconic ability?
Yeah, that's okay. So we decided to set up the class reveals that way. Number one, to highlight the fact that we're committed to class interdependence, and so the classes are going to have a very strong identity in the game. And part of that is having abilities that are very iconic. It doesn't mean it's not to be confused with epic abilities, which would be these, very powerful abilities that are difficult to gain. And these are abilities that could be fairly mundane, fairly common, but just have a lot of flavor that is unique to that class. So Feign Death, for example, is the monk iconic ability, and it doesn't mean that Feign Death's some crazy difficult to obtain ability has all these powerful effects to it. It's a bread and butter ability of the monk, but it absolutely defines the monk in a very unique, iconic way.
Gotcha.
So that's what we mean by that.
Well, so if the monk's iconic ability is Feign Death, though, does that mean that the monk will be the only class that has that ability?
It doesn't mean that they'll be the only class that has that ability. It means that that ability is for the monk one of their main kind of identifiers in their tool set for what makes a monk a monk. It also means that if there are other abilities that are similar to Feign Death, it will be to a lesser extent. They won't be quite as full or as powerful as Feign Death is for the monk.
Gotcha. So while we're talking about Feign Death, I think a lot of people are concerned about Feign Death being used as kind of like a get out of jail free card, so to speak, that you can just go around and grief other people without consequence. So I'm sure you're aware of that. What are your thoughts on steps that you could take to prevent that?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you make an open world game, you do that with eyes wide open, knowing that there are benefits and there are complications that can come with that. And part of that is players who want to engage in activities that we would call griefing, or harassing or causing problems for other players. So Feign Death is one of those abilities that when it was originally conceived way back in the day, there was no way to account for all the different ways it could be used.
Right.
It's one of those abilities that's really cool and allows for a lot of emergent gameplay, but it comes with a lot of potential complications as well. So we're definitely aware of that. One of the main tenets of our game is challenge, and so in the content that we design, we want to make sure to not trivialize that aspect of our content. So we have a few ideas with Feign Death to not rob it of its role and its potency, but to not allow it to trivialize and circumvent the challenge and the tension, and when it comes to like PvE content. So I'm not going to go into what those ideas are just yet, but we are keeping an eye on that. When it comes to the social aspect, where players would use Feign Death to grief other players or to, wipe that group so they can get to the content instead, that will very, very quickly become a CS issue. Any kind of behavior like that in the game is something that we will be keeping an eye on and won't tolerate. But the other side of it is, again, one of the positives of having an open world game is you have communities that truly do allow for players to develop their own reputation, good or bad, and a player who is engaging those kind of activities has to live with the consequences. The consequences that they're going to alienate the player base.
Yeah.
And I think I'm expecting to see a lot of self-policing might not be the right word, but players will have to kind of eat the consequences of their actions in that way.
Sure. So you mentioned epic abilities, and I want to go back to that for a second. Sure. Because I know you mentioned it briefly also back in a stream way back in like 2016, but what is an epic ability, and like how are they acquired?
Cool. So I'm reminded of the scene at the very end of what was not the most recent Star Wars movie that came out, but the one before that, like not the
Force Awakens?
I think it was The Force Awakens, the one that ends with her finding Luke Skywalker.
Yeah.
So I'm reminded of that scene where in Terminus exist these certain masters, if you will, of class-based masters of their order or their line, and they hold very powerful information about certain abilities and skills. I would include skills in that are only achievable by finding these certain masters and convincing them to teach you what they know. So when we think of epic abilities, we're thinking of abilities that are very powerful, thus the epic nature, and very hard to obtain, because it's not only about finding this person, but it's about, similar to, you think of like epic weapons and the epic quests that go along with them, it's about convincing this person through whatever hoops they think you need to jump through to convince them that you're worthy to learn this. So that's what we mean by epic abilities. Very powerful, rare in that it's going to take... it's not only at the highest tier level that you would find epic abilities. Let's say there's 5 epic abilities for each class. Totally pulling that number out of my head right now, but let's say there's a finite number. Some of them may be obtainable at lower levels, but they're all going to be things that are difficult for you to achieve. Certainly by yourself, you're going to need help, and things that you really have to invest time in to gain. But we're really excited about it because it gives us some really cool opportunities for abilities and skills to make some really, really unique, powerful, flavorful stuff.
Yeah, that definitely sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the healing archetype for a little bit, because the question is, how are each classes within an archetype, or the healer, for example, how are they going to be balanced in such a way where they can each individually fulfill their role, but in a way that is unique? You know what I mean? It feels different. So, for example, a cleric, from my understanding, they have just straight high healing numbers, while the shaman probably uses more debuffs and stuff like that to decrease the incoming damage, and that's how they keep their party alive. But then how, like, would the druid have their own unique way of keeping the party alive on their own?
Yeah, so it's important that each of the healers, so just to say in general, we want each of the healers to be able to do the job. You know, whether you have a cleric or a shaman or a druid, in a group situation, all three of them, the goal would be that they would be able to adequately heal that group. But they're going to do it in very different ways, and they're going to have different fortes. That's kind of how I tend to think of it. So the cleric's forte would be a single target healing prowess. Highest, when you talk about numbers, yes, they have the highest number, the highest healing throughput when it comes to single target healing.
Okay.
So they're going to be really, really strong at keeping that tank alive, and just really able to keep them up through massive waves of damage to a single target. And then they're going to have other things to round out their healing kit, like some moderate heal over time, some moderate absorb, but the forte is going to be in that single target.
Okay.
And then their defensive buffs and things like that. So then the shaman, their forte is, as I've said, they're masters of overtime, and so instead of having that massive single target healing, they have the ability to pepper lots of targets with these really potent heal over time spells. And they then, in that sense, have an easier time than the cleric, keeping the group as a whole kind of, able to address different healing needs in the group. But they are offset then by not having a strong single target healing, and then further offset through their utility with slows and things like that. The druid is interesting. Druid has been, I told a few of the guys on the team not too long ago that the druid has been a challenge for me, because in that role of wanting to make them unique and different in their fortes and in the way they heal, it's been an interesting challenge finding their spot. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. We are going to be prioritizing the class reveals once we get back home from PAX, but the simple way to describe the druid's healing arsenal would be indirect. They're an indirect healer, and I'm kind of okay with letting your imaginations run with that a little bit.
Yeah,
what that could mean.
I can think of some interesting ways and that could be applied. Okay, that's cool. Will all healers be able to resurrect, though?
That's the plan, yes. There will be different positives and different negatives in terms of how potent and helpful their resurrection spell is, and maybe what negatives or penalties it leaves you with. But the plan is that they would all be able to resurrect, yeah.
But in their own unique way. Okay, cool. So for shamans, one of the most defining abilities, or you could even say an iconic ability for the shaman in EverQuest, was cannibalize. They were kind of this like witch doctor type support class. Do you think that shamans in Pantheon are similar that way? Like, will they have an ability like cannibalize?
Maybe.
Okay, we'll take that.
Maybe.
Do you agree though that the shaman in Pantheon is maybe not as primal. What's their identity?
Yeah. So the shaman in Pantheon are very ancestral.
Okay.
And in kind of a metaphysical sense. So I think the description on the site is that shaman walk through or in every age at once. And the idea there is the shaman's ability to buff and debuff and do the things they do is that they can look at an entity and they can see in a moment the entire lineage of that entity all the way back, and then are able to draw out weak traits, debilitating traits, unfavorable traits throughout that line into the present, or they're able to draw out beneficial, strong traits throughout that line into the present. So not quite as like animalistic or primal, you said,
or
tribal
yeah.
as what we may think of as the EQ shaman. Not totally removed from that, but just a little more mystically aligned with the lineage and the ancestry of things.
It's familiar but different is what you would say. Yeah. I like that. That's a cool concept.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the tank role for a little bit now. This is actually this is kind of a debate that was the forums really actually when I started off. It's a big debate about whether warriors should be able to dual wield shields. Have you given any sort of thought to anything like that?
I always, the moment I became aware of that thought, that was always really interesting to me, and I hope that it's not too disappointing to anybody, but that is not in the cards right now.
Okay. Well, at least you were able to settle it for us.
Yeah.
Bummer.
Sorry to anyone that disappoints.
I guess the opposite of that would be, is there going to be a class that favors two-handed weapons, like some sort of berserker type class?
So what I can say now is, I know there's not hardly any information about the Dire Lord right now, but the Dire Lord class will be required to use edged weaponry because one of the basic premises of the Dire Lord is that they are trying to cause as much blood as possible to be let from their enemies. So bloodletting is a big part of how they do what they do, and so they use edged weaponry exclusively to maximize that. Now, that could be done either through dual wielding, or it could be done through a two-handed sword. And there's going to be bonuses, different types of bonuses depending on which one you use. So I could definitely see situations where certain Dire Lords would prefer to use the two-handed weaponry because of the different positives, different advantages that would give them.
Even while tanking?
Even while tanking.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Okay. And is there any sort of magic involved, though, in that sort of bloodletting, like to manipulate the blood? Or is it just, okay.
I guess you could simplify it to say the process would be getting the blood out. Not that they have to have it out to do everything they do. They can manipulate blood from while it's still internal as well. But getting the blood out is what allows them then, in that kind of mystical sense, to manipulate it, move it, change its properties, draw things from it, inject things into it, things like that.
Interesting. Okay, I know there's a lot of people that'll be excited about that. That's a nice little teaser there.
Yeah.
So I guess conversely, the Paladin.
Yeah.
This is kind of a class that's typically a hybrid, but they kind of get the shaft in some games if they can't tank as well as a warrior and also can't heal as well as a cleric. So what can you say to the Paladin fans about what they're going to be able to bring to the table?
Yeah. Well, in general, I'd say, just like with the healers, it's going to be important that each of the tanks are able to do that role effectively. So I don't want Paladins or Dire Lords to be concerned that we're going to end up in a situation where it's only warriors. That when you need a serious tank, when you need someone to really be able to soak up the damage, you bring a warrior. If you don't have anything else, then you'll take one of the two. That's not how it's going to be. All three tanks will be able to do their role effectively, but again, they're going to have different fortes. They're going to have different ways of doing that, and they're going to bring different advantages to the group through their utility. The Paladin I'm excited about because, just concept-wise, the Paladins were once clerics. And so they have access, and they've kind of grown up and cut their teeth on this cleric order of the restorative arts of the cleric. But the difference in the paladin is, if you're familiar with the lore of our game at all, you know that during the Deicide War, the Revenant army was created by the Ravaging Lord, and the Revenant army wreaked havoc, and they are still present. They still exist in the world, and they kind of, you have your basic undead, just kind of your traditional undead you think of, skeletons and things like that. But the Revenant are actually a very significant player in the world as far as an undead presence. And the Paladin, the idea with the Paladin is they have experienced something heartbreakingly, soul-wrenchingly tragic at the hands of the Revenant, and it has caused them to not forsake the cleric way, but to kind of lay down the tome to take up the sword in this kind of crusader-like avenger role. And so it's a little bit of a, it's not your classic like righteous, do goodly paladin. It's more of a, so there's a little bit of a vengeance story here, in that the paladin is on a righteous mission to exterminate this presence. And so one of the cool things with the paladin is we really want to highlight their versus undead prowess, in that they will be devastating when it comes to conflict with undead. So that's going to add a little bit of an interesting layer when it comes to tanking, when you have a paladin tank in an undead area. There's more detail to go into in terms of how you balance that, because you can't have a paladin who is obviously a very adept tank with restorative abilities, now able to do devastating DPS towards undead. Why wouldn't you just always want a paladin tank in an undead area? Obviously, we're going to take steps to balance that when they go into whatever state they're in when it comes to being versus undead. There's going to be offsets when it comes to some of their tanking arsenal or restorative ability or whatever it is, because they're so focused on dealing with this undead issue. So there's a few other little cool things about the paladin that I'll save till later, but I think they're going to have a really, really cool role, and I think more than ever before, we're going to try and capitalize on some of these iconic things you think of when you think of the paladin, like their verse undead prowess, their restorative contributions, things like that.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. So I hear a lot of people that compare the summoner, like they just assume that the summoner is going to be kind of similar to what the magician was in EverQuest. Do you think that's a fair assumption? Like, how similar are they actually?
I think it's fair. I'll say, I loved the magician in EQ. I played it quite a bit. One of the things that always kind of felt lacking to me, though, was their actual summoning arsenal, because you had, obviously the pets is kind of the main thing, and then you had a lot of out of combat things like summoning food and drink and summoning, no rent weapons and some bags and mod rods. But to me, it seemed like there was so much more potential in like more of the in combat summoning utility, or kind of the, literally that idea of reaching your hand into this dimensional pocket and pulling out something at a moment's notice to react to things that are happening. So I'd like, my goal is to build that into the summoner, where you're really seeing them kind of capitalize on the summoning ability in more of a real-time, even reactionary kind of way to things. I'm going to save this for more of the reveal, but and I'll say too, their pets are going to be really awesome, really cool, and so that whole dynamic, I want to make sure we keep, and really capture that feeling again, where the summoner pets are going to be known as very awesome. But then go into more detail later of kind of some of the ideas of how they'll be in combat using their summoning ability to react to certain situations and to deal lots of damage.
But more than just pets.
Exactly.
Cool. So how would the wizard then be different from a summoner?
Well, the exchange there, I think, has traditionally been the wizards don't have pets, and so their damage dealing is really in the form of raw, just devastation when it comes to what they can unleash through their spells. And in that sense, we're not changing the wizard a whole lot, in that we want the wizard to be able to deal just unbelievable raw amount of damage through their spells. What we are doing with the wizard is we're trying to give them I want them to have more control over how they deal damage and when they deal damage. And I want them to be able to feel more meaningfully engaged from fight to fight. I don't want to see wizards standing up, blowing a third of the mob's health off, and then sitting down for the rest of the fight to get mana back. I want them more actively engaged and able to manage their mana, both in the expenditure of it and in the regeneration of it, so that they can plan for burn times where they're wanting to just unleash, but then also able to still contribute damage while they're recuperating mana. I know we've got some of that system in place in pre-alpha, so some of the pre-alpha testers have been able to experience what that's like, and the feedback's been really good, because the wizard class feels much more active, much more involved, more often than I think traditionally has been the case. So that's how I would differentiate those two classes, though, is that the wizard is really bringing that raw damage and able to control when and how they wield that much more so than traditionally was the case.
That's cool, but they're not gonna just sit back and spam nukes the whole fight, right?
No, they're gonna have a lot more mobility maybe than players are used to, which is something I'm really excited about for them. And that mobility as well will even play into how they deal damage, in the form maybe of momentum. If they really get behind one of those fireballs, then you might see more damage.
Cool. All right. Well, how about binding? Like, is this something that only the casters will be able to do, to bind a soul? And like, would they be able to bind anywhere in the world that they want?
It's a good question. I don't have a very satisfying answer for that yet, because I'm intentionally waiting until we get a few more things nailed down, a few more ideas. Some of it has to do with, may not see a direct connection, but some of it has to do with how we're going to handle player-based teleportation, meaning are certain classes going to have the ability to transport themselves and others to different locations, and how exactly is that going to work? It's not, we have some pretty set ideas, but want to make sure that we're seeing the whole canvas when it comes to travel, when it comes to relocation, and then when it comes to binding. What I can say about binding is that in the streams, I know a lot of players have expressed concern about, us respawning at the start of the zone.
Yeah.
And that's purely for testing purposes. There will be a place where you respawn. It will be at first your starting city, where you zone into the game for the first time is where you will respawn. So then the question is, well, how do you change that? Is it going to be through NPCs? Is it going to be through players? Generally right now the plan is that we would have something similar to what we've seen before in the bind system, but there are still a few things we're trying to nail down and decide.
Sure. So, traps in dungeons or really anywhere. First of all, will there be traps?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. And is this the sort of thing that like a rogue might be able to, if they disable a trap, take parts from it and then maybe build their own traps?
That's a good question. Yes, rogues will be able to dismantle traps. Not all traps are the same though. So you're going to have traps that are more mechanical in nature, that rogues would be obviously the ones adept at dismantling that. You're going to have traps that are arcane in nature, that a rogue may not know exactly what to do. So you might need a certain, arcane-oriented class to be able to unravel that magic. You're also going to have some traps that are, concealed in ways that a ranger, for example, might be able to perceive in an outdoor setting, let's say, more so than maybe a rogue typically would. So yes, there are going to be traps. Yes, there are going to be different ways to dismantle those traps in different situations where different classes will be more adept at doing that. And yeah, I love the idea. Again, not going too deep into the rogue, but the rogue I absolutely see as this wonderful mixture of assassin and trickster, where they're deadly from the shadows, and they're also very almost playful in all of the different ways they have to mess with you, and either through things they can throw, like we've said before, with like the vials and the kind of impromptu mixture of things, to traps, both disarming and setting and creating. I'm really excited to see some of that take shape.
Awesome. So I guess really the only class we haven't covered yet is the Ranger. It's always a fan favorite, although sometimes they are the butt of some jokes. But so what can you tell us about the Ranger? Because unfortunately they're the butt of jokes because it's another classical hybrid that has kind of an identity crisis, as I would call it. So how does the Ranger fit into the world of Terminus?
Yeah, I was actually talking to a guy at the meet and greet last night who played a Ranger. I think I remember him saying he played a Ranger literally as his only class throughout all of his time, his many years playing EverQuest, and
wow.
I had to give him kudos because it's one of those classes that people really resonate with, and it just never felt like it was fully realized.
Yeah,
at least for a pretty long time. So with the Ranger, again, more details to come, but the Ranger is a DPS class, and it will hold its own very well in that regard. The Ranger will use a mixture of ranged and melee-oriented combat and playstyle. I think of Rangers as more of like the plan for them is more of like a war archer, where you're not going to see Rangers, for the duration of fights, standing back and just shooting arrows the whole time. Their goal is going to be to get in close and do their devastating damage through melee combat. But the bow is going to be vital for them to both disengage from combat and then re-engage in combat.
Interesting.
And then they're going to have lots of situational opportunities to use the bow. It's not that Rangers wouldn't be able to disengage and let loose with their ranged combat and maintain their level of DPS, but it's more of a shorter duration, bursty kind of thing, more tactical, designed to get them back into the fight more quickly, where they are going to pull out their weapons and get back to business. There's also the animal affinity side of the Ranger, which I'll save that for later, but that's also going to be part of how they are able to do their damage and kind of control things and maneuver the way they need to.
Okay, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
I guess actually before we wrap up, I would probably get in trouble if I didn't ask about the Necro, because you gave us a good little teaser about the Bard, that the Bards are looking pretty good right now. But what about the Necro? Where does the Necro stand right now?
Yeah, so we definitely hear everyone, and we know that it's not only the Bard but also the Necro. That's a very highly anticipated class. So we are wanting as well to get that in, but it's going to depend on how quickly we finish the current classes, and the Bard and Necro just happen to be the next one in line. So if we can get it in, we will. If we can't by launch, then we'll be getting it in as soon after as we can.
All right. Well, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, I think we touched on them all. So I really appreciate you sitting down and telling us a little bit about them.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, I trust that you found this discussion as interesting and exciting as I did. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comment section below. And also, if you learned something, make sure you hit the like button and hit the subscribe button as well, so that you don't miss any of my future dev interviews. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.